Yeah, thanks to Celia and actually everybody at TSU for inviting me here. As you mentioned, this is a work in progress, and it's a book chapter, or sort of a fledgling book chapter, that will be part of a wider edited volume on development zones in Asia. And so, having said that, it would be really nice to get any sort of comments or thoughts or questions at the end that might help me sort of sharpen my argument or think in new directions. And it's also just one small part of a larger sort of proposal that I've actually submitted on global aviation, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. But in this case, this is a sort of a microcosm of some of the things that I would like to be talking about in the larger project. So worldwide air passengers are expected to double within the next couple of decades to about 7.8 billion. I'm not sure what the figures are exactly now. But this is all despite the growth in the flight shame movement, and particularly the growth is in Asia, especially in China. And the sort of flight shame movement is mostly a global north phenomenon. This piece of the project stems from a long-term project where I'm looking at how people in the aviation industry are managing sort of the still increasing global growth in air travel. And I look at the tensions and trade-offs between dealing with labor shortages, pilot shortages in particular, or the so-called pilot shortage, new technologies, and the climate crisis. And this Nepal portion that I'll be talking about stems from ethnographic research that I did in 2016, mostly in 2018, so there were 2 times that I went to Nepal to do this. And you'll see that a lot of what I'm talking about is based on sort of micro-level ethnography, interviews, participant observation, particularly with air traffic controllers, pilots, airport managers, and route planners as well, and people who are members of the civil aviation institution in Nepal. So what I'd like to do, and I'll be following up on this research in October of this year. So what I'd like to do is start by painting a picture of the landscape of flying in Nepal, and I'm actually curious to find out whether or not anybody has actually flown in and out of Nepal before. Okay. So both internationally and domestically. Oh, good to see. It's a very interesting place. So for those who haven't, it is characterized by a lot of holding patterns, a lot of delays. A lot of this stems from the fact that Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu is the only international airport, and that international passenger movements have increased by about 16% over the past couple of years, and is expected to increase even more. So what you have, and this is not just peculiar to Nepal necessarily, but I think the case in Nepal is an interesting case to look at. You have a lot of holding patterns. There's only one runway, and both domestic and international air flights take off and land on one runway. This is one of the crowded hangars at Kathmandu, Tribhuvan International Airport. And that's an example of the runway on the left. They have repaired it actually, but since this year there have been, basically what people do is they actually go out onto the tarmac every night to repair the holes. And they've more or less upgraded it around this year, but that has been happening for the past 10 years or so. So the resources aren't necessarily great, but air traffic has grown extremely fast over the past few decades, and most of it has to do with labor migration. In particular, there are a number of mostly men from rural villages flying to the Gulf states in order to take part in construction projects. So think of, for example, the South Asian migration to the Gulf states, or Doha, for instance, to build the World Cup Stadium, which is and a lot of it is very sort of exploitative work. And you have a lot of out-migration from Nepal, a lot of remittances. I think Nepal is one of the places that has the highest number of remittances relative to GDP in Asia. Now, so just to give you a little sort of example of what congestion is looking like. It's not just typical for Nepal, as I said. You also get congestion at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, where I live. But I think it takes on a peculiar character in relation to sort of geopolitics and Nepal's position as its sort of landlocked country squeezed between what's called the two boulders of India and China. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I also want to talk about what people do in order to sort of alleviate these traffic jams in the sky and how they're to be arranged and to what effect. And given all these increases in air traffic, aviation personnel tend to work on fixes in order to make sure that planes can continue to take off and land smoothly. And a lot of these fixes are technological fixes. So, for instance, expanding space or time or investing in different kinds of aircraft, which is a little bit hard to do in Nepal. Dealing with manipulating time in a way. So, for instance, in 2018, the Tribhuvan International Airport increased its opening time from, I believe, 18 hours a day to 21 hours a day. So this is another sort of fix you can use in order to get the traffic to be moving more smoothly. And there's also a proposal for 3 new international airports to be built in Nepal, and that's a very different, another story that's rather controversial of which airport is going to be the second international airport in Nepal to alleviate some of this traffic. Now, all of these developments actually have profound geopolitical consequences, and some of these fixes also involve proposing new routes. I'll explain that in a little bit later. So I think theoretically, what I want to say is, while the literature on development has often focused on territory on the ground, such as like road building, dam building, economic corridors, what I'm looking at is a sort of a more three-dimensional approach. And what I'm interested is in how claims over space, airspace, are related to claims over space on the ground. And the argument so far is that, let's see, here it is, argument in progress, is that aviation development is often in response to sort of increasing congestion, how to alleviate increasing congestion in the air. Jason Kahns, Ashley Carson, Townsend Middleton have written a little bit about this idea of a choke point as also presenting interesting moments of opportunity, and I'll pick up on that a little bit later on. In Nepal, there's a lot of talk about new entry points into Nepal and new routes in the air. As I'm just going to go back to this map so you can see here. This is the most congested one right here, is the Simara corridor. This is where most international flights, particularly those from India and other places, go in and out. And this is extremely congested. There are other routes as well, but there are other, as you can see, the red ones have proposed new entry routes, and nothing necessarily has happened with those just yet. So what I'm interested in is actually looking at how congestion presents opportunities for sort of stakeholders in aviation to jump to, in a way, if they find themselves stuck in geopolitics on the ground. And there are peculiar aviation loopholes, like wet leases and overflights. And what that does is that helps expand space in new ways, especially in a landlocked country like Nepal. So, ultimately what I'd like to do is show how infrastructure is both driven, at least air infrastructure is driven by geopolitics on the ground, but that also routes in the sky do not necessarily overlap with the sort of developments on the ground. So to add a new airport, that will change a route, it'll change airspace, but what it does as well is it also changes the ideas of the future shape of the nation. And And really, I wanted to sort of put out a call, I guess, for a multi-dimensional or volumetric, if you read sort of Stuart Eldon and Frank Billet's forthcoming work, that kind of approach to looking at mobility. And so what I'd like to do here is look at three scenarios where some of this is happening. First, I want to talk a bit about airspace. And airspace is interesting. Airspace used to be fairly, like historically, airspace used to be fairly individualized, where like somebody, a farmer who owned land, wealthy farmers who owned land, would consider their land territory to expand into the heavens as well. More technically now, airspace is, the world is completely carved up into multiple horizontal and vertical layers of airspace. And one that's most prominent is the FIR, the Flight Information Region, which is an example that you can see here. And that's technical, sort of a technical term for the airspace that's controlled by a national territory. And in the case of India, you see here that it often extends also into ocean space, and it does not necessarily map onto the contours of the nation, necessarily. However, Nepal is, there we go. Nepal, the FIR in Nepal is mapped completely onto the contours of the nation, and then it's further split into two sectors. There's a western Nepalganj sector, and then the wider, bigger eastern Kathmandu sector. And then it's also split up into sort of vertical classes, A through G, with its own rules, but we won't talk about that necessarily. So you have this kind of cartographic shape of the nation, the proverbial yam between the two boulders of India and China. And people find, that at least aviation personnel have found themselves sort of battling border disputes, not just on the ground, but in the air as well. And as the late tourism and culture minister has said time and time again, we are not just a landlocked country, we are an airlocked country as well, which says quite a lot about its geopolitical position. When I talk to air traffic controllers and pilots about the air traffic along the borders of Nepal, a lot of them immediately responded about how difficult it was. And one pilot said, quote, "It's a hassle, but with Indian FIR to fly above India, it's really not that easy. They're our neighbor, they're supposed to be our big brother, but you tend to hear these complaints from the air traffic controllers in India. They'll say, one of your aircrafts just crossed our FIR, and then we'll have two jets flying simultaneously with your aircraft. And they say, if this happens again, we're going to ground you for security reasons." This is end quote. Another one, and I'm not going to read this in great detail, but this is also about the fear of pilots, about worrying about if their wingtips are just going to brush into Indian FIR. And then you have this sort of how it's a pain for us, I feel on my right, just a few fighter jets tracking me. And then they say, here, I've actually not heard so many complaints coming from Chinese FIR. Okay, they're also very strict, but this is mostly from India. So again, you see this, it's almost like a snapshot in time in 2018 of the kind of geopolitics of Nepal, the relationship with China and India, at least in the aviation sector. That China, while approached with some wariness, is much more permissive. And another controller told me once, well, China lets us do anything in their airspace, but India is just about profit and politics. Now, there's an unevenness between Chinese and Indian airspace permissions, and although Nepal is caught between the two nations, it's often presented in the media as kind of being a place that is sort of the victim of China and India. Oh, Nepal can't really do anything. It's caught between these two massive geopolitical forces. But actually, that's not necessarily true. As others have also mentioned, Galen Merton, as a scholar of Nepal, has mentioned this as well, that actually Nepal has an interesting sort of agency, because it maintains agency in the process of accepting any sort of Chinese intervention. It's often in a position to play the two countries off each other. So this there's a bit of a savvy bureaucracy that manifests itself in the air. And this feeling of constraint, or this choke point, feeling landlocked and so forth, it brings about interesting moments of opportunity. And one example of this sort of moment of opportunity is to maneuver around Indian airspace restrictions. And to jump scale in a way, I don't know what to call it, maybe you can help me out, by appealing to international regulators. So there's this proposal that was put out in 2014, I think, to the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, from Nepal to propose a new air route, an international air route. And this is the Himalaya 2 proposed route. People have been talking about this route for quite a long time in Nepal, at least from the Civil Aviation Authority of Nepal, CAN. And the idea about this route is that flights originating in Europe and the Middle East would actually fly over Nepal, over Guwahati in northeast India, over Kunming, over a bit of Myanmar, to flights in Eastern Asia, say to Hong Kong, for instance. And this is because the ICAO have talked about how this Bay of Bengal corridor here is extremely congested in international airspace. And so the proposal from the Civil Aviation Authority of Nepal for for quite a few years now, has been, well, why not alleviate this choke point by diverting some of the traffic over Nepal. And this route, their reasoning, is that this is a climate-friendly move. And I don't know to what extent you can be climate friendly when it comes to this, but at least what it does is it shaves 15 to 20 minutes off of any flights coming, if you're to fly to Hong Kong, it shaves about 15 to 20 minutes for the flights that would be going down in this area. It also, and I need to check my statistics here, it would save 114 nautical miles and an annual 1,660 tons of fuel. But what, of course, also happens is that Nepal would get, in return, overflight costs. And what overflight costs are fees that aircraft operators pay to the countries that they fly over, but do not land in or take off from. So in this case, per flight, it would be approximately $200 to $250 per flight. And what you do now is that you'll get all the flights that would normally fly over India would be diverted to Nepal. So this is one very interesting way that sort of the Nepali aviation personnel have decided sort of to move the geopolitics, to move the air routes up closer to Nepal to get some sort of benefit, perhaps a spatial capital accumulation, a space for experimentation. And this is another example of a sort of a volumetric expansion where flights can be diverted. This proposal has been put in every single year, I think, to ICAO. There's always talk about it. They may be taking it more seriously over the next year or two, and this is something that I'm going to be looking at in more detail later on, fingers crossed. But right now, India and Myanmar have not granted permission for this either, which is going to be a big problem. Other aviation officials say that actually it has to do with Nepal's low level of radar technology. That means it's one of the reasons why this proposal hasn't really gone through. So it might still very well be a dream, and congestion is still growing. So if this is not going to work, there are other ways that Nepal air authorities can sort of maneuver around airspace restrictions. And that's kind of at the level of existing air routes and creating aviation loopholes, as in this other case of Himalaya Airlines. And Himalaya Airlines is an airline that was established in 2014. It's a joint Sino-Nepali venture. It's one of the very few, in fact, the only joint Sino-Nepali airline venture. And Tibet Airlines holds a 49% share in Himalaya Airlines, and Yeti International, which is a large aviation group in Nepal, holds the other 51% at the moment. And it's currently the only airline that, the only Nepali airline, half-owned Nepali airline that connects China and Nepal. And the main frustration with many aviation personnel in Nepal is that this airline is seen by India as a Chinese company because there's 49% of it is owned by Tibet Airlines, a Chinese airline officially. And what that means is that it's not given any landing rights in India. And it can't get access to that market. And one of the biggest markets for airline companies in Nepal is, of course, to fly to India. That's where most people are flying from. So if you're flying into Kathmandu, certainly there are lots of international tourists. There's a lot of out-migration to the Gulf, but the majority of flights are to and from India. So Himalayan Airlines can't necessarily tap into that market. But what it does is that it seeks other aerial routes. And the main route that it seeks is the labor migrant routes. And so, again, I mentioned this a bit earlier, but due to years of political ups and downs, not to mention the 2015 earthquake in Nepal, you have a situation where there are a number of rural villages, in mountain villages, but also villages in the Terai in the south of Nepal, where mostly young men, and also due to decreasing agricultural livelihoods, need to find some sort of source of income, and one of the greatest sources of incomes is, of course, migration, and many of them do go to the Gulf states for work. Also, of course, India, but also Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia as well. Now, increasingly, a few other places in Southeast Asia. So, Himalaya Airlines is now decided that, or not decided, but now flies to Daman, Doha, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Dhaka, Kuala Lumpur, so all this sort of labor migrant routes. And it's now adding multiple China flights as well. So it's adding flights to Beijing. It just added a flight to Chongqing on February the 6th. And then, of course, not February the 6th, sorry, January the 20th. And then they had to stop it on February 6th, 7th due to coronavirus. So that was sort of their new city that they're flying to. Hopefully, not hopefully, but they'll still fly there. But you see the sort of directionality. So if you think of sort of what's happening here, you have this sort of southwest directionality that this airline is moving into of the migrant routes versus this sort of interesting southeast alliance of the airline. And they're now kind of adding more Chinese cities. They're going to be adding Lhasa in Tibet quite soon to their destinations, which is another interesting story. And so, to some extent, it's an example of the agency, you might want to call it, of sort of Nepali aviators vis-a-vis sort of the geopolitics of China and India. But it's also a very stark example of the influence of China in Nepal, which is growing. And again, another question I'd like to ask you guys. I don't know how many people are working on Belt and Road Initiative projects, but to what extent are these aerial routes? How do you see the relationship between sort of these new aerial routes and new airline carriers that are Sino-Nepali ventures? How does that tap into the Belt and Road Initiative work, if any of you are working on that? That's my question to you. I don't necessarily know the answer to that. I've thought about it, but I'd be interested to hear if anybody else is working on that. It's an interesting case. Just to give you a little bit of background, if any of you ever look at this is a bit of a nerdy thing, but I really like looking at this forum for pilots called PPRUNE, or PPRUNE, and there are a lot of horror stories about Himalaya Airlines and its management. So it hasn't had great success with management, except for in the past couple of years. And people are saying that, you know, it's become better because now they're starting to extend their routes to China. What they're also doing is using wet leases, and in order to lease its aircraft to lease its aircraft to places where they can't fly. So to give you sort of, in other words, what a wet lease is that they had a recent one to Bamboo Air, which is a Vietnamese-based airline. And in aviation, a wet lease is basically when an airline company leases out one of its aircraft to another airline company who pays an hourly rate as well as all the fuel and taxes. And this often happens when there are seasonal flights to particular places. You might see this happening. But it also happens when a lessee is banned from flying into a particular country. So it's entirely conceivable that, and there are a couple of wet leases that might be happening with Himalaya Airlines in the future. It might be entirely possible that Bamboo Airlines is the sort of loophole in the air, so to speak, to bypass Indian ground restrictions, because of course Bamboo Air can land in India. It's not a Chinese airline. But this kind of wet lease has severe local repercussions as well. They don't bring any employment for Nepalis. And of course, you know, within what's happening with Nepal vis-a-vis China and India, there's been a lot of accusations of Himalaya Airlines sort of pandering to the Chinese state. It's a Chinese airline. The criticism is that they're capitalizing on these lucrative migrant routes for Chinese profits. So this is just kind of an initial exploration into seeing how these kinds of loopholes, for instance, with the wet leases, can create new routes and outlets for, of course, profit to be expanded when you can't do this on the ground, in a way. And it's sort of an argument to think, actually, about a more volumetric approach. You could also do this with cables underground and so forth. But what happens when you look at sort of new routes in the air? How does that connect with expansion on the ground? Or should there be a real separation between the two? I don't know, but perhaps thinking of sort of a more multidimensional kind of volumetric way of looking at geopolitics and capital expansion. So those were just some thoughts on those three examples of looking at changing sort of Himalayan routes. Let's see. And that is sort of my favorite sign from the Nepal Airlines hangar. I just had to put that up there because it made me laugh. What are these conclusions so far? You have a situation where right now this is a particular snapshot, I would say, of Nepal at this moment of time, or at least in the moment of time of 2016 to 2018, with a lot of people in the civil aviation organization saying that, oh, India is being restrictive, a lot of criticism against the sort of the airspace restrictions in India versus the permission of China. Why not? Why not take advantage of China if we can't, if we don't have enough resources in Nepal? I would say that the new airports, the three proposed new airports, will bring a different kind of dynamic to this. So I think to take a step back and to say this is really what's happening in this particular moment of time, again, between 2016 and a bit of 2018. When I go back in October, hopefully maybe new things will have developed. Of course, it shifts the dynamics a little bit. The second thing that I kind of wanted to say is that sort of aerial development could be considered kind of a spatial form of the ongoing will to improve, perhaps. and that the formation and extent of an aerial zone circulates capital in very particular ways, and perhaps peculiar ways, unpredictable ways, ways that you wouldn't necessarily think about if you were just focusing on airports, for instance, or on connections on the ground. So what about airports and its connections to air routes and airspace? Nepal is also a particular case. I don't know to what extent it's so different from other cases. Again, if anybody else works on aviation, I'd be very happy to hear. It can't have other zones except for in the sky. In particular, it's a landlocked country, but sometimes this is often used as an excuse, maybe not an excuse, but as a reason to seek out other outlets. So therefore, other outlets are upwards, skywards. And the next step, I think, is to look at comparative developments in other parts of the world, to what extent you can make comparisons with other congested spaces, congested airspaces. And then I've just put in a proposal to look at similar developments in Peru, between Lima and Cusco. There's a controversial new airport in Chinchero, which is, of course, where Machu Picchu is, to look at these kinds of developments. Also in sort of high-tech areas like the Netherlands, with Schiphol Airport, which is extremely congested, and now there's the opening of Lelystad Airport in order to serve as an outlet for all the short-haul tourism flights that go to Mallorca, because Schiphol Airport is at full capacity now, right? So how do you look at kind of these outlets to take on the congestion, of course, against vis-a-vis extreme concerns about the climate, extreme concerns about the climate crisis. How are people making these decisions? Where are they making the decisions? How are they making the decisions in the air? How are they going to change routes? And also, how are they going to, change takeoffs and landings of aircraft? There are a number of ways, of course, that you can speed up takeoffs and figure out dealing with landings with just one engine running and so forth in order to fit all the aircraft in this container of space, this limited container of space that we have available. So those are just some future plans. But as I said, this is a sort of work in progress. I'm putting this chapter together. These are 3 examples of how we can look at sort of volumetric development, if you want to call it that. So from you, I'd be interested in sort of tips for either sharpening the argument or some of your own work, if it overlaps in any way. And any questions, I think. Yes. So that's it for now. So thanks for listening and bearing with me.